Welcome to episode 10. Today we'll be covering the Guðmundur and Geirfinnur disappearances. This is District Dark. In 1974, two men disappeared in Iceland. They were not related and they vanished nearly 10 months apart. One was 18 years old, the other was 32. One disappeared after a night out, the other left home after a phone call and drove to a harbor town. Neither man was ever found. That alone would have been enough to make the case unforgettable in Iceland, but that was only the beginning. Because in the years that followed, police arrested 6 people and said the disappearances had been murders. Those 6 people eventually signed confessions. Some said they had taken part in the killings they could not actually remember. Some said they came to doubt their own minds. Some said they confessed only after months of isolation and pressure. There were no bodies, no murder scene, no forensic proof, no eyewitnesses who could place a killing in front of a jury, and still convictions followed. Decades later, the case would come to be seen as one of the most troubling miscarriages of justice in Europe. But that does not solve the first mystery. What happened to Guðmundur Einarsson, and what happened to Geirfinnur Einarsson? And how did 2 disappearances turn into one of the most disputed criminal cases in Icelandic history? This is the Guðmundur and Geirfinnur case. Tonight's case is different from a straight disappearance story. It begins with 2 missing men, then it becomes a murder investigation, then a confession case. Then it becomes a case about memory, isolation, pressure, and whether people can be pushed into admitting crimes they may never have happened the way police said they did. This case matters for 2 reasons at the same time. First, because the 2 men vanished and were never found. And second, because the official answer that once seemed too close to the case did not hold up. In 2018, Iceland's Supreme Court acquitted 5 of the 6 original defendants. That meant the legal story changed, but the disappearances remain unsolved. To understand this case, it helps to understand Iceland in the 1970s. Iceland was a small country, and in 1974, its population was around 220,000. Serious violent crime was rare. That meant disappearances stood out in a bigger way than they might have in a larger country. A missing person case was not just another headline. It could become national news fast. That small scale matters. In a place where people feel only a few steps removed from each other, a mystery can spread through the whole country quickly. So can panic, so can pressure. When the police do not have an answer, that lack of answer can become a public problem very fast. And in 1974, Iceland would get 2 disappearances that seemed to demand answers. The first was Guðmundur Einarsson. The second was Geirfinnur Einarsson. Despite sharing a surname, they were not related. Guðmundur Einarsson was 18 years old. On the night of January 26, 1974, he had been at a dance in Hafnarfjörður, part of the greater Reykjavik area. At some point that night, he left and began the long walk toward his home, about 10 kilometers away. He was last seen by a motorist after nearly falling in front of a vehicle. After that, he was never seen again. That last sighting is important because it is one of the few mixed points in the entire case. A young man late at night walking home, a road, a witness in a car, then nothing. There was no final phone call, no confirmed meeting, and no body found after a quick search. No witness who said they saw him get into a fight, a car, or a boat. He simply disappeared into the Icelandic night. In many missing persons cases, there are at least a few clear paths to examine. The person may have spoken about leaving, they may be in trouble at home, there may be a known person they plan to meet. In Guðmundur's case, the public facts were thinner than that. His disappearance was troubling partly because it seemed to happen in open space, with almost no clear event attached to it. There were searches, there were questions, but no solid answer came. And then, months later, there would be another disappearance. Geirfinnur Einarsson was 32 years old. On November 19, 1974, he was at home when he received a phone call. After that call, he drove a short distance to a cafe near the harbor in Keflavík. He left his car behind with his keys in the ignition, but he never returned. He vanished. That disappearance felt different from Guðmundur's case, but in another way, it felt even stranger. With Guðmundur, there was a lonely road and a long walk in the dark. With Geirfinnur, there was a phone call, a decision to leave home, a drive to the harbor area, and then a parked car with no owner. That phone call became one of the most important details in the case because it suggested purpose. Geirfinnur had not simply wandered off. He had apparently gone somewhere because someone contacted him. But who had called him and why was never clearly established in public evidence in a way that would solve the case. Searches were carried out around the harbor and coastline. Nothing turned up that gave a clear answer. No body, no direct proof of murder, no confirmed reconstruction that could show exactly what happened after he reached Keflavík. Now, Iceland had 2 missing men in the same year, and police had no solution for either one. The 2 disappearances were separate in the facts. They happened months apart, the men were not related, the last known circumstances were different, but in a small country under public scrutiny, they began to take on a shared weight. The police were now facing not just one mystery, but 2. And as time passed without a clear answer, public and media pressure grew. The pressure matters because it shaped what comes next. When police are under intense pressure to solve a case, especially in a country where violent crime is rare, and the public expects an answer, the investigation can change in tone. The focus can shift from a patient fact building to the need for a breakthrough. That does not mean every pressured case goes wrong, but in this one, pressure became part of the story. By the mid-1970s, the disappearance cases were no longer just unanswered files. They had become a national test. Could Icelandic police explain what had happened? Or were they staring at 2 mysteries with no physical trail to follow? At some point, the disappearances were no longer treated simply as missing persons cases. Police moved toward the idea that both men had been murdered. That shift was huge. A missing person investigation asks where someone went. A murder investigation asks who did it. Once police moved into the second frame, the whole case changed. The questions were no longer only what happened to Guðmundur and Geirfinnur. It became who was responsible and how could police prove it without bodies, without a known crime scene, and without forensic evidence tying anyone to the killing. The problem would end up shaping every part of the case, because once investigators decided they were looking for murderers, the investigation needed people, not just theories, and eventually the police found a group of young suspects. So, with the names coming up, I'm just going to say their first name because, I don't speak Icelandic. Over the time, attention settled on a group of young people on the margins of Reykjavik life. Among the names would become central were Sævar, Erla, Kristján, Viðarsson, Trugi, Guðjón, and Albert. These 6 would eventually become the core defendants in what came to be known as the Reykjavik Confessions. The path from disappearance to confession did not happen all at once. The investigation moved through suspicions, statements, changing theories, and long interrogations. At the center of it was an idea that one or more of these suspects had been involved in the deaths of Guðmundur and Geirfinnur, and that if police kept pushing, the full truth would emerge. But later, the criticism of the case would focus on exactly how that pushing happened. Because by the time the confessions came, the interrogations had already become extreme. One of the most important facts in this case is the use of solitary confinement. Several of the suspects were held in isolation for long periods. Erla was held in solitary confinement for 242 days. 2 of the suspects were held for more than 600 days, and Trugi was held for 655 days. Sævar was held in custody for a total of 1,533 days. Those numbers are not side details, they are essential to understanding the case. Solitary confinement can weaken a person's sense of time, memory, and judgment. That is one reason this case later drew so much international attention. Critics said the suspects had not simply been questioned hard, they had been put through an environment that could break down confidence in their own minds. Amnesty International later pointed to this case as a major example in criticizing Iceland's use of pretrial solitary confinement. The suspects were also interviewed again and again under pressure, with little outside contact. According to later reporting and case summaries, drugs including Mogadon, diazepam, and chlorpromazine were used during the investigation, and sleep deprivation and other abusive treatments were alleged. Sævar, in particular, later described harsh treatment, including water torture, and said medication affected his memory. The confessions that came later cannot be separated from those conditions. Eventually, 6 suspects signed confessions connected to the disappearances, but there was a major problem from the start. The confessions did not emerge from a case full of physical proof. They became the proof. There were no bodies, no confirmed murder scene, no forensic evidence, and no eyewitnesses to the killings. The confessions became the center of the prosecution. That matters because it changes how the whole case has to be understood. In some murder cases, a confession supports other evidence. Here, the confessions were asked to carry almost the whole structure. The suspects later said they had no clear memory of committing the crimes. Some said they came to believe they must have done something, even though they could not truly remember it. Others said they signed statements just to end confinement and pressure. That is one reason this case became so famous. It raised a frightening question. Can a person be pushed so far that they stop trusting their own memory and begin to accept a story built by others? Erla became one of the central figures in the case. Later reporting described how she came to believe, or at least to say, that she had been involved in the murder story and she did not clearly remember. In a later interview discussed by The Guardian, she said that deep down she knew it had not happened, but she had reached a point where she no longer trusted herself. Erla's role in the case became complicated in another way too. While 5 of the 6 defendants were later to be acquitted on the murder-related convictions, Erla's own conviction for perjury was not overturned in 2018. That left her in a different legal position from the others, even though the wider case around the confession had become apart. Later, in 2022, she was awarded compensation and received a formal apology from the Icelandic government related to her treatment, including time in solitary confinement. Her story became one of the clearest examples of how memory, pressure, and fear can mix in a case like this. One idea that later became strongly linked to this case is something called memory distrust syndrome. The concept is associated with work of Professor Gilsi Guðmundsson, a former Icelandic detective and later an internationally known expert on suggestibility and false confessions. In this case, the basic idea was that under extreme pressure, isolation, and repeated questioning, a person can stop trusting their own memory and begin to rely instead on what interrogators suggest must have happened. This idea matters because Guðmundur and Geirfinnur case was not only about people saying, "Yes, I did it." It was about people saying something even stranger. "I cannot really remember it, but maybe I did it." That kind of confession can sound convincing inside an interrogation room, especially if investigators already believe they are dealing with guilty people whose memories are blocked or buried. But later critics argued that this was exactly how false confessions were built in the case. Guðmundsson later said he had worked on many miscarriages of justice in different countries, but had never seen a case with such intense interrogation, so many interviews, and such a lengthy solitary confinement. As the case widened, more people were dragged into it. In 1976, Einar, who was Erla's half-brother and chairman of the Icelandic Basketball Federation, was held in solitary confinement for 105 days, along with Magnus Leopoldsson, Vladimir Olsen, and Sigurbjörn Eriksson, after being implicated in the case. These men were not ultimately part of the final murder convictions, but their involvement showed how wide the net had become. This is important because it shows that the case did not move cleanly from disappearance to evidence to defendant. Instead, it spread. More statements led to more names led to more pressure. The investigation grew larger while still lacking the basic physical things that most murder cases rely on. In a case like that, every confession can become a door to another confession. Even uncertain memory can be treated as a clue, and the more that happens, the harder it becomes to tell whether the investigation is discovering a truth or building one. Eventually, the prosecution put forward a story of murder. Sævar, Christian, and Trugi were convicted in connection with Guðmundur's alleged murder, while Albert was convicted of helping hide the body. Sævar, Christian, and Guðjón were convicted in connection with the alleged murder of Geirfinnur, and Erla was convicted of perjury after implicating her half-brother and others. But even at that point, the official story had serious weakness. It still had no bodies. No one could show where Guðmundur had been killed. No one could show where Geirfinnur had been killed. No one could show where the bodies had been taken in a way that's supported by physical proof. The court accepted the confessions, but the wider public debate did not end there. In fact, over time, the case only became more controversial. Because once the defendants began to speak about what the interrogations had been like, the convictions no longer looked like a solid ending. It looked like the start of another argument. It is possible to convict someone of murder without a body. That is true in many legal systems. But cases like that usually need strong supporting evidence. Blood, a murder scene, witness testimony, digital proof, or some chain of facts that points clearly in one direction. This case did not have that kind of support. That is why later reviews returned again and again to the same basic problem. The convictions rested mainly on confessions gathered under conditions that later came to be seen as deeply unsafe and unreliable. As years passed, more and more Icelanders came to believe the case had gone badly wrong. The BBC later described it as one of the most shocking miscarriages of justice Europe had ever seen. But if the convictions were wrong, then the first mystery returned in full force. What actually happened to Guðmundur and Geirfinnur? This case did not collapse overnight. Doubt built over years. People began asking how 6 people could be convicted when there was no body, no forensic evidence, and no clear witness account of the murder. They also began asking harder questions about the interrogations themselves, the isolation, the drugs, and the way memory was discussed during questioning. Over time, the case became more than just guilt or innocence. It became about whether the justice system had allowed pressure to replace proof. And because Iceland is a small country, that debate carried real weight. That was not a distant scandal, it was a national wound. Years later, even Iceland's then Prime Minister, David Oddsson, criticized the investigation and prosecution of the case after the Supreme Court declined to hear it in 1998. Reporting later said he also gave financial support to Seaver in trying to get the case reopened. That tells you how deeply the case had changed in public memory. It was no longer simply the story of two missing men and the people supposedly convicted of killing them. It had become the story of whether the state itself had created a false answer. In the 2010s, the effort to reopen the case gained real force. An official police investigation report was handed to the Office of the State Prosecutor in 2013. In 2017, Iceland's rehearing committee concluded the case of the 6 defendants should be reheard by the Supreme Court. Erla's perjury conviction was not recommended for the same rehearing. That was a major turning point. Because once the system that had once accepted the convictions began formally reconsidering them, the argument was no longer happening only in books, media, and public debate. It had returned to court. By then, the case had also become internationally known through books, documentaries, and reporting, often under the name the Reykjavik Confessions. The reason was simple. It seemed to show, in a way, almost impossible to ignore, how a murder case could be built out of pressure, doubt, and confessions that did not stand on solid ground. On September 27, 2018, Iceland's Supreme Court acquitted 5 of the original defendants of all charges connected to the alleged murders. That ruling was a major reversal, 44 years after the disappearances. The acquittals applied to Sævar, Christian, Drugi, Guðjón, and Albert. Erla's perjury conviction was not overturned. The acquittals mattered for an obvious reason. They officially recognized that the old murder convictions could not stand. But they also mattered for another reason. They brought back the case to where it had started. 2 men were still missing. No one now stood legally responsible for murdering them. The state had removed the official answer, but it had not replaced it with a new one. That is what makes this case so unsettling. The correction of injustice did not solve the original mystery. After the acquittals, Iceland moved toward compensation and apology. Reporting said that the government later approved compensation totaling 815 million Icelandic kroner to those acquitted or their families. Erla was also later granted compensation and received a formal apology related to her treatment during the case. Compensation matters, but it does not erase what happened. Some of the people at the center of the case had died before legal correction came. Drugi died in 2009, Sævar in 2011, and Christian died in 2021. That means some of the men who spent years carrying convictions did not live to see full long-term aftermath. And for the families of Guðmundur and Geirfinnur, compensation to the defendants did not bring back answers about the disappearances. The case remained split in two. There was injustice done to the accused, and there was an unanswered fate of the missing men. So what happened to Guðmundur? That question has never gone away. Guðmundur was last seen on a dark road after leaving a dance, almost falling in front of a car. There are possible explanations that do not involve murder at all. Accident, exposure, misadventure. But the public reporting on this case does not supply a confirmed answer. No body was found, and no later evidence clearly resolved that question. Because the murder case took over so much of the national attention, the original disappearance sometimes gets flattened into only the first chapter of a wrongful conviction story. but it should not. An 18-year-old disappeared and was never found. That part is real, regardless of what happened later in court. And because the official murder theory could not hold, the case of Guðmundur's disappearance returned to a state of uncertainty. And what happened to Geirfinnur? Geirfinnur's case remains just as open in the end. He took a phone call at home. He drove to the Keflavík harbor. His car was left behind with the keys and the ignition. He vanished. Searches did not produce his body. The murder conviction's connection to this case was later overturned. There has been later tips and later witnesses-related developments. Case summaries note that in 2015 and 2016, new witness-related information drew official interest and led to a renewed investigative steps. But no public development has closed the case in a final way. So, the image we are left with is still a haunting one. A man leaves his home after a call. He drives to the harbor. He leaves his car. And then simply, he is gone. The case is often remembered for wrongful convictions. That makes sense. The confession, the isolation, and later the acquittals are what gave it worldwide attention. But at its center, this is still a disappearance case. Actually, 2 disappearance cases. 2 men vanished in 1974, and Iceland still does not know for certain what happened to either of them. The legal system once said it had the answer. Later, it had to admit that the answer was not sound. That leaves the hard truth. The state corrected one injustice, but the first mystery remains. And because of that, the Guðmundur and Geirfinnur case still lives in 2 forms at once. As a missing persons mystery, and as a warning about what can happen when investigation needs an answer more than it has evidence. The Guðmundur and Geirfinnur case matters far beyond Iceland. It is studied because it shows how unreliable confession evidence can become under extreme conditions. It is discussed because it shows how solitary confinement and prolonged pressure can damage memory and judgment. Amnesty International still points to the case when criticizing Iceland's use of pretrial solitary confinement. It also matters because it shows how a justice system can correct itself very late, but not fully heal the damage. The acquittals did not restore the lost years. They did not undo isolation. They did not tell the families of Guðmundur and Geirfinnur what happened in 1974. They did not produce bodies, a crime scene, or a final explanation. They only removed an answer that should not have stood. In some ways, that makes the case more haunting, not less. Because once the false certainty falls away, all that remains is the original darkness. 2 men gone, no verified killer, no known final place, no ending. In January 1974, Guðmundur Einarsson disappeared after a night out. In November 1974, Geirfinnur Einarsson disappeared after a phone call and a drive to the harbor. Neither man was ever found. In the years that followed, Iceland told itself it had solved the mystery. 6 people confessed. Courts convicted them. The country had an answer. But it was not an answer that could last. By 2018, 5 of the 6 original defendants had been acquitted. The confessions no longer held the case together. And the old certainty gave way to the older truth. The disappearances were still unsolved. That is where the case stands now. Not closed, not settled, not finished. Just 2 names, 2 vanishings, 1 broken investigation, and a question that has lasted a half a century. What happened to Guðmundur and Geirfinnur?